The war on Ukraine has taken a devastating toll on that country as it marches to the one-year mark of fighting on Friday. I'm live now with former U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, Stephen Pifer, for analysis of this nearly year-old war. Stephen is also a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution Center on the United States and Europe and the director of the Brookings Arms Control Initiative. Good morning to you.
Morning.
Thank you so much for being here. Now, when this conflict got started, the notion was floated that it would last for 3 days. It quickly became clear that that was not the case, but did you think that we would be here some 361 days later?
Well, what I thought, and I was pretty confident, is that the Ukrainians would resist. That, I think, has come to a total surprise to Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin. What I did not expect was for the Ukrainian military to resist so staunchly. So my own expectation a year ago was that the Russians likely would win the force-on-force fight, but then have to deal with a very bloody, decades-long guerrilla insurgency in Ukraine.
Got it. Air raid sirens were going off as President Biden revealed to the world that he was in Ukraine on Monday, speaking out saying that Russian President Putin has been, quote, dead wrong in this war. Now, Putin has again delivered a speech suggesting the U.S. is planning to attack Russia. In his rebuttal today from Poland, Biden assured the Russian people that that is not true and called what Putin has done to the Ukrainians abhorrent. What do you think of Biden's move with his first trip to the region since the start of the conflict and then Putin's posturing here?
Well, I think it was an appropriate time to go, both to visit Poland, but also to make the trip to Ukraine, which sent a very strong signal to Ukrainians that America is going to back them. I think it also sent a strong message to Moscow and to Russia that the United States intends to support Ukraine and provide Ukraine the wherewithal that it needs to defend itself against this unjustified Russian attack.
Russian forces pulled out of Kyiv, Ukraine's capital, at the end of last March. Kyiv remains free. Is this the biggest embarrassment in everything that's happened for Putin? Kyiv would, of course, be a key psychological victory for Russia.
Well, I think it's been striking how badly Russian military forces have performed over the past year. Now, to be sure, a lot of the credit goes to the courage and the tenacity and the skill of the Ukrainian military, but it was not just the failure to take Kyiv, but if you go back and look at the original Russian invasion vectors, out of north of Belarus towards Kyiv, out of the northeast from Russia, out of the occupied parts of Ukraine in the east and the south, it suggested the Russian goal was to occupy perhaps the eastern 1/2 to 2/3 of the country. And they've utterly failed in that. Moreover, you saw in the last 5 months of 2022, the Ukrainian military pushing the Russians back. And so perhaps 60% of the territory that the Russian military occupied with its invasion in last February has now been liberated by the Ukrainians. That really is speaks to a lot to the Ukrainians who went into this war with a military with inferior equipment, lower numbers, and expectations that were pretty difficult to meet.
A complete David and Goliath kind of scenario there. Now, last October, President Putin revived the draft to fortify the ranks he has, trying to control all that territory that you were just mentioning. Russians were seen then rushing to the borders to escape that mandate. There have been issues with Putin providing even just proper food to his own soldiers. How would you characterize the state of the Russian army at this point? You've already pointed out they've been sort of failing miserably, but just as a standing army in general, what's going on?
Yeah, the Russian army is not, I think, what people expected a year ago. They have lost now reportedly as many as 200,000 casualties, as many as 60,000 killed in action. Western reports are that the Russians have lost perhaps 50 to 65% of their modern tanks. And the overall performance, I think, has been very much against expectations. And I think one thing that we've learned, perhaps, is that while we understood that corruption permeates Russia's economy and society, the defense sector was not immune. And although the Russian military has spent hundreds of billions of dollars in the last 15 years to modernize its conventional forces, those forces have not performed at the level that the Kremlin expected.
We also know that Russia very tightly controls the messages its own people get, but the rest of the world obviously is seeing this kind of performance that you've just detailed out of the Russian military. And so everybody else in the global community is making their own assessment and noting the status. A bipartisan group of American lawmakers is pressing President Biden to send F-16 fighter jets to Ukraine. Late last month, Biden announced that 31 M1 Abrams tanks would be sent to Ukraine. Putin has said either of these moves would be considered an intense provocation, but doesn't seem to be acting out exactly against the U.S. Should we be braced for that, especially since we're about to cross this 1-year mark and sometimes bigger things happen at those kind of stages? Nothing about this scenario allows Putin to claim, victory. He's still really losing face here.
Yeah, my guess is that there are a couple of red lines that the Russians have. One is they don't want to see American or NATO forces fighting on behalf of Ukraine. And I think President Biden has made clear, NATO leaders have made clear they are prepared to provide Ukraine arms and ammunition, but not their troops. And then the second line might be deep strikes into Russian territory. But the Ukrainians have already made very clear that, one, they're not asking for American and NATO troops, and two, they've said that they would use Western-provided weapons only to attack Russian targets in occupied Ukraine, not against Russia proper. Okay. So it seems to me that there is more that we could provide the Ukrainians. And I would argue, I think the Biden administration in whole has done a very good job in managing the American part of the supporting Ukraine and the diplomacy and the arms to Ukraine. The one criticism I would have is I think we should be providing more arms to the Ukrainians to give them the possibility to change the situation on the battlefield and possibly foreshorten this war.
Okay. Today, China's foreign minister said in an apparent dig to the U.S. that certain countries need to, quote, stop fueling the fire in Ukraine. Beijing has struck a no-limits partnership with Moscow. The foreign minister linked this war to Taiwan's fight for independence, saying today, Ukraine, tomorrow, Taiwan. U.S.-Chinese relations already not in a great place. What happens if President Xi Jinping gets more involved in this conflict?
Well, first of all, let me note that, the Chinese foreign minister's comments were misdirected. If China really wants to see this war end, it should talk to Vladimir Putin in Moscow. Mr. Putin can end this war by just giving the order to withdraw Russian military forces from Ukraine. That would end it. As for China, it seems to me more broadly that while the Chinese want to be supportive of Russia, they've also been careful. And they understand that, first, a lot of the things that the Russians are doing by attacking Ukraine undercut principles that are very important to Chinese foreign policy, such as territorial integrity, sovereignty, and peace.
Alrighty.
But moreover, the Chinese are also, I think, mindful that they have economic relations with the United States and Europe that they would like not to put in danger.
Exactly. Thank you so much for your insight as we near this 1-year anniversary, an anniversary many thought they would not see, and one where Kyiv is still free. We appreciate your insight so very much.
Thank you.